Strubin.
Ms. Eckland, I wonder if I could ask you about a different topic, please, which is that of ventilation in school. The inquiry has a witness statement from a Professor Noakes. I think it's probably in your bundle.
Yep.
You don't need to go to it because I think I can just set out in brief terms what she says at paragraph 8.2 of her witness statement, which is this. My view is that while the evidence base around infectious disease is still weak, there's a growing body of evidence that indicates enabling better ventilation and indoor air quality in school environments will have a positive effect on the health of children. This is in terms of exposure to communicable pathogens and other microorganisms such as mould, exposure to air pollution and enabling thermally comfortable environments. Whilst ventilation or air cleaning is not a silver bullet and will not reduce transmission of COVID-19 or other respiratory infections to zero, there is some evidence to indicate a positive impact in schools and may enable environments to be more resilient to both seasonal infections and future pandemics. And she goes on over the page, and I won't go to this because it's quite simple. She sets out that one of the steps that could be taken in the future is to improve schools' knowledge base on the environmental impacts on health and well-being in relation to air quality as well. And she sets out some recommendations about that. Can I just ask you, please, and I have some questions on behalf of core participants about the position during the pandemic, which I'll come back to, but may I please ask what the Department for Education's what work it's doing at the moment, or whether or not it is doing research in this field of ventilation across the school estate more broadly?
Thank you. Yes, there's some research underway which we've been following closely, which is not yet published, which essentially looks at the effect of, so it's specifically air cleaning, which is not quite the same as ventilation, but it has the effect of removing particulate matter. And we are waiting for the publication of that research, which we look forward to. In the meantime, we really welcome joint work we've been doing with experts, including Kath Noakes. But we've been looking at our guidance on new build schools and the ventilation standards that they must meet. I think it's not yet in the public domain, but the new framework that we've put out around new build increases and clarifies the standards. And having done that, we aren't, and when we have the Bradford study publication, we're going to go back round and look at our guidance and standards for existing schools.
I'm grateful, thank you. One of the questions that core participants have asked is why the Department for Education didn't ensure mitigations such as air filters were deployed more widely during the pandemic, given that they're relatively low cost and could have enabled safer attendance, particularly for children from clinically vulnerable families, whilst waiting for long-term building upgrades.
Thank you. So what we did during the pandemic, as soon as SAGE had given a clear opinion on this, which was in the early summer of 2021, we started the programme to roll out carbon dioxide monitors in schools. Carbon dioxide monitors are a proxy. They don't tell you about the cleanness of the air, but they do tell you how well ventilated your space is. And we did that because we wanted to try and make sure both that we were helping people do really low-cost things to improve ventilation, like open the window, which does work very well, and that where that wasn't possible, either because of thermal comfort or because of the way the building was designed, we could then target the provision of the air filters at the spaces with poor ventilation. You don't get any benefit if you put an air filter in a well-ventilated space, because the air is moving anyway.
I mean, the question's asked whether it was adequate that the first significant action in relation to ventilation was the delivery of air units in 2022. So, in other words, at a very late stage in the pandemic.
So, as I say, we had a clear position from Sage on this for the first time in summer 2021. We then, I don't think we could have rolled out the CO2 monitors more quickly than we did after that. And as soon as schools reported back to us on areas of the school where they couldn't bring the ventilation down, we started shipping the filters. And I will double check this, but I thought the first filters were shipped in 21. I can double check that.
If it's not immediately apparent, that can be checked.
Yes, and we prioritised special schools and alternative provision for both for the CO2 monitors and then for the first delivery of the air filters. I can check that and come. I don't want to tell you something that's not right.
Yes, I'm grateful. The other question that's asked is whether or not, beyond the extant Building Bulletin 101 with guidelines on ventilation, the Department for Education left the matter to responsible bodies for schools to address ventilation.
Yes, so we responsible bodies are so called because they're responsible for all matters to do with their building, and so that is absolutely right. But in the same way that they're responsible for the maintenance of the building and other forms of upkeep.
And sorry, I was going to ask the follow-up question, which is whether or not you perceive a problem with that, or whether you think that is the correct route to take. So
we get asked and think about this question in respect of quite a large range of issues related to buildings. And the trade-off is, do you try and kind of take all of that centrally into the delivery of the department and try and get right, telling every school in the country exactly which bit of their building most needs fixing next? Or do you take the position that people who are closer to the child and the building are better positioned to do that? And the department's consistent position over a long period has been that it's better for the responsible body to hold that. And we do have quite extensive guidance for responsible bodies on how to exercise those functions. We have various forms of support for them across different parts of the building, but fundamentally the duty sits with them.
I'm going to move on to a subject which has been raised by long COVID kids, and it's this. You attended the Permanent Secretary Stakeholder Group meeting on education on long COVID in children and young people. Long COVID in children and young people was discussed 3 times at that group, so in June, August and September 2021, and representatives from the Local Government Association, teachers' unions and representatives from school and educational institutions were in attendance. Do you agree that the stakeholder group should have included input from patient advocacy groups like long COVID kids who were instrumental in the recognition of this new paediatric disease?
So I might just, in giving the answer to that question, I might just explain what the Permanent Secretary Stakeholder Group was and how it worked, because I think it'll help. The answer is no, but I really want to explain why the answer is no, because it's not because we don't take really seriously the advocacy and work of such groups and the risk to children. So the Permanent Secretary Stakeholder Group was set up in January 2021, in the aftermath of the period we discussed around particularly the very difficult issues around the 4th of January. And we'd had a lot of feedback, including through that difficult period on testing, about how we were engaging and communicating with some of our really core stakeholders who held responsibility for action across the system. And in some cases, we hadn't done enough. In other cases, actually, we had done a lot of communication, but for various reasons, it wasn't always being represented. And there was something about, particularly, we knew that the reopening of schools in March would be very difficult, and it would require us all to work really closely together in partnership. And so the Permanent Secretary Stakeholder Group was set up as a weekly meeting of those who had the responsibility to take the action across the system to make things happen together. And that was the kind of core framing. And it had a stable membership. We always had the same people at the meetings. And we shared the scientific advice. We invited people from PHE regularly to talk about different health aspects in order to create a group who could collectively work in partnership on that reopening. And then it was felt to be a very valuable group, and it persisted beyond the 8th of March. It continued to meet weekly, then subsequently moved to fortnightly. It still exists and meets monthly. Actually, I think we just moved to once every half term because in a slightly different time with a slightly different set of drivers. And the agenda was often driven by the membership. So members of the group would say, we would really like to hear from an expert from PHE or UKHSA about this particular issue. And that was a pattern we'd established, particularly in looking at some of the kind of risks as we moved towards March reopening, but then continued through the series. We started every single meeting with what was called the voice of the child and young person. So a member of the group would bring, in some cases we had children attending, in other cases people would bring direct voice of children into the meeting, so that informed everything that we did. But we didn't, I think it's true to say, ever invite people who are not part of that core delivery group or experts from across government who could be held within that circle. And that was partly because we shared things with that group confidentially and carefully in order to make sure we were building that partnership for reopening. So I think there is a different question, which is, could we or should we as a department have had more contact with long COVID kids? But I don't think for this particular meeting, set up in the way it was to do the thing it was set up to do, that we'd have been doing something very different from what we did in general in those meetings if we'd done that, and it wasn't a thing we'd done on other topics.
And the evidence from some of the experts in the inquiry, and indeed some of the witnesses, have reflected research that, unsurprisingly, children with long COVID would like to be able to attend school, but also are at risk of suffering disproportionate outcomes because of the nature of their illness. And I think in your report you've set out about young people with long COVID being most likely to report changing their career plans due to the pandemic. How did the department at the time deal with the specific issues and challenges faced by pupils with long COVID? And there's a second part to the question in terms of what it's doing now as well, in terms of the ongoing challenges. Yeah.
So I think the first thing I want to say is how sorry I am for any child who's suffering from long COVID, and particularly for children like those whose voice we heard through the evidence, including the video that was shown at the beginning of this module, for the parents of children who've been affected. And I know that for many there have been compounding challenges beyond those presented by illness because of the very wide range of symptoms and experiences, the difficulties in diagnosis, particularly in the early stages, which meant that some sufferers have not always felt or been taken seriously. And I say everything I say in that context. And as a department, we sought always to follow the scientific and public health advice and to reflect it in our guidance, and we sought to do that in relation to long COVID, and we continue to do so. So that's the sort of core of our approach. We were helped by the appointment of Dougal Hargreaves as Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor in August 2020 because he was involved in the children and young people with long COVID study, the study known as CLOCK. And again, I think you can see in the documents, we were hearing from that and other studies and taking and looking at that as we went through. We wouldn't generally, as a department, as it were, have our own view on a medical or health issue. We would usually take that from Department for Health, PHE, and then reflect it. And it's quite unusual for us to do guidance to schools on a condition by condition, rather than thinking about how it might affect people. So again, there was a period where we were trying to work out whether we should give schools some guidance on it. I think we were quite keen to. We were trying to work that out with the Department for Health and PHE. In the end, we didn't issue any specific guidance to schools, and that was partly because I think it was difficult in that engagement with DHSC and PHE to work out exactly what you would say that was specific to this, rather than reflecting wider advice about how you manage children with other types of long-term or chronic conditions. And we sort of particularly didn't want to put ourselves in a place where we were encouraging teachers to do diagnosis.
I'm grateful. The second issue arises in relation to clinically vulnerable children and the evidence that the inquiry has heard, which is very specific to the pandemic period and to the return to children, the return of children to school in September 2020, and what the expert to the inquiry has characterised as a more punitive approach taken to attendance in that period in England as compared to other jurisdictions. Does the Department for Education have reflections on that period and whether the right approach was taken to attendance and specifically to the position of those children who were clinically vulnerable themselves or who had a family member?
Yes. So I think we saw the overall government advice on clinical vulnerability and clinical extreme vulnerability for children change a lot between the very initial stages of the pandemic, where I think it's in evidence from some people who are significantly more medically qualified than I am, but the children were identified on a somewhat precautionary basis early on during that period of uncertainty. And over the summer, both the requirement for the clinically extremely vulnerable overall to shield was lifted in August, and the vast majority of children who'd been previously identified as clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable were effectively removed from that designation and told, yes, I think it is now safe for you to attend school. There was a small number of remaining children under the care of a health professional who were told that they should have that health professional advice. And what we did was we reflected that position in our guidance, and we sought to strongly encourage attendance for those for whom it was safe to attend. We did reflect in the guidance that position for children who were still under the care of a health professional, and we also reflected that there might be a period of adjustment for children, so that there is advice in our guidance about managing that, about encouraging head teachers and teachers to talk to families who might be anxious about it.
I think the issue's been raised that for children who had a clinically vulnerable parent, they weren't dealt with in the guidance. And again, just looking at it from the perspective of a child and a family who might be very worried about a child going back to school and the risk that might present to the rest of the family, was that an area in which there could have been more guidance or more nuance?
Yes, and again, I think there was in the central changes, there was advice that said families of those who are clinically vulnerable could go to work or to school. So again, there was a position set out. I completely appreciate that. It felt very difficult to people. But again, I don't think it was for us in the department to create a different set of rules than those that were being set out by health colleagues.
I'm grateful. Melody, I think those are my questions. I'll just check. Yes. I'm grateful, Melody.
Thank you very much, Ms. Howard. Ms. Howard was just there.
Ms. Aglen Hood, I appear on behalf of Long COVID Kids and Long COVID Kids Scotland. You attended a stakeholder meeting on the 9th of June 2021 at which Dr Shamez Ladani of Public Health England stated that children should not be labelled with long COVID i.e. a medical condition, as this has potential to cause longer-term psychological harm. My client's experience was that the existence of long COVID was minimised and disbelieved, including by their children's schools, not overdiagnosed. DfE hasn't produced guidance to advise schools on long COVID then or since. Did Dr. Ladani's advice minimising paediatric long COVID affect the approach taken by Department for Education?
So, as I've explained, we invited Dr. Ladani, who was the sort of person PHE recommended that we have, to the meeting in response to members of the meeting suggesting that it would be a good topic to discuss. My recollection is that everybody listened to her attentively. I think that I think that it's true that the minutes slightly kind of gloss what she said. So I think she was talking a bit about the extent to which there's the heterogeneity of symptoms and the fact that there are a lot of overlapping symptoms with other conditions. But we wouldn't, as a department, have taken an independent view on a health condition. We would have taken, and we wouldn't just have taken our advice from one expert appearing as a stakeholder group. We would have taken our advice from DHSC and PHE as a whole on a medical condition. So no, I don't think what she said at that stakeholder group affected the way we behaved, and the lack of provision of guidance was about taking care not to step into that health space when we weren't the best authority on that.
Just picking up the evidence you gave on guidance just now to Ms Dobbin. In terms of long COVID in September 2021, you gave evidence that you wouldn't ordinarily give guidance on a freestanding health condition. Do you accept that there was something different about long COVID in the sense that it was a novel paediatric disease which significantly affected thousands of children quite quickly? And in those circumstances, DfE had a role both to alert schools and teachers about its existence, but also to give guidance on what the schools could do in terms of its effect on attainment and attendance.
So again, it's true that I would say it would be very rare for us to give condition-specific guidance. It's also true that there are some circumstances in which we might, for example, in relation to an outbreak of a particular disease, but we would never, ever do that without DHSC, PHE backing advice. And I mean, it would be completely irresponsible for us, I think, to do that unilaterally.
Thank you, Ms Ackland-Hood. Thank you, Manny.
Thank you, Ms Hennett. Mr White, hey, she's over there.
Ms Ackland-Hood, I have a question on behalf of the children's rights organisations about the remit of the Department of Education during the pandemic. And what we'd like to understand is the ability of the department to influence decision-making in some broader issues outside of schools or social care, but which still hugely impacted children. And the sort of decisions that I'm talking about are how health protection regulations that limited inter-household mixing were framed and whether children should have been treated differently. For example, under-5s were exempted from them in January 2021, whether playgrounds should have closed, whether the guidance should have clarified that play was exercise. Those are just some examples. And quite apart from the rights or wrongs of those decisions, were these decisions the sort of decisions that the Department for Education would have been at all involved in or had any ability to influence?
So the Secretary of State for Education does also have a named role as the government's lead minister for children. It's one of those interesting, there's lots of people call for there to be a Minister for Children. Actually, technically, there is one, and it is the Secretary of State for Education. I think what I would say is the extent to which Secretaries of State choose to step into and exercise that wider responsibility and the issues on which they exercise it tend to be a bit of a matter for them. So any time you have a cross-cutting ministerial role of that kind, and this goes for roles like, it's quite common for a minister, for example, to have a role on a cross-cutting equalities matter as well as their core role. Whereas in relation to your core role, you typically have standing teams, existing guidance, sets of levers, pieces of responsibility. When you exercise your cross-cutting role, some of those levers, teams and responsibilities sit in other people's departments. And if you want to, you can call on your cross-cutting role to have influence, but you're not, as it were, obligated to, and the system doesn't necessarily push you to in the same way. So again, sorry, this might sound a bit technocratic, but the civil servants in your own department will kind of feed you stuff to do all the time. Civil servants in other departments over whom you might have an interest in a piece of their policy probably won't. And so you have to decide to go and get involved in that. Now, I think on the issues you describe, it would have been open to the Secretary of State for Education to get engaged, to assert their role as cross-government Minister for Children. And there are some examples of that. So the example that I would give is the work on health visitors and the under ones. Not part of the department's policy, enormously part of the department's interest in looking after the most vulnerable children. And there was, again, you can see in the papers, a lot of activity to try and exercise our cross-cutting responsibility on that. I have personally reflected quite a lot on those issues around family mixing, and actually particularly play, and where sort of the technical responsibility for play spaces was with MHCLG because of their responsibility for local government. But I think I should have given, or caused to be given, to the Secretary of State more advice about intervening on those issues, and I take that responsibility.
So do you think there's anything structurally that could be done to make it easier then in the future pandemic for those? I reflect on your question, on your answer earlier to a different question, that people at the centre often think they know more about children's rights than perhaps they do, and whether or not that can be solved more by the Department of Education.
So I think there probably are some structural things that you could do, and indeed some of the structures that we've put in place as we've thought about mission-based government for this government have created an architecture that give us more reach and more connectivity. And again, sorry, I framed it as a bit as the Secretary of State going and prodding other people, but actually some of it is about creating common cause and common interest as well. And I do think those structures could have helped. They're particular to a sort of way of working this government has asked us to operate in, but A, we could unilaterally choose to sustain some of those ways of working, and B, we could be required to work more in that way across some of these areas of cross-cutting responsibility.
Thank you. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Twite. Mr. Jacobs, who's over there, right down the end.
Good afternoon. Ms Ackland had a question, if I may, on the role of public health and health services in supporting schools during a pandemic. In December 2020, the National Association of Head Teachers said in a press release, what we have is the education system supporting the public health response to COVID, when what we need is support from the health system to preserve the quality of education for young people. Teaching is the only profession that is being asked to do two things: preserve education for children and play a part in the mass testing programme. Can I just ask for your reflections on that, and whether you do think there needs to be more of an emphasis on public health and health services supporting schools on the sort of public health element of the response?
So I've talked quite a lot about that specific testing period. And again, I think my sort of hierarchy of desirability would have been more people we could have wrapped around schools to help them do it at the top, but not doing it at all at the bottom. And I do think there are other examples of many professions during the COVID period who went above and beyond what would normally have been expected. And it's hard to say that that's right or wrong. I think some of it represented a really deep human urge that a lot of us felt to do everything that we could do. And again, I will just say, I think teachers and head teachers, teaching assistants, and actually children themselves did the most extraordinary things during the pandemic. I think if you're asking a broader question, I think that partnership between public health and schools is incredibly important, and it works in both directions. I think there are a huge number of things that schools do as part of their daily business that are critically important to public health, to developing really good understanding of positive health behaviours, PE and school sport, school food plays an enormous role, but I also think public health has a role in supporting the education of children. And I think where we see diminution or fraying of those relationships, we have a less good offer both for children in schools and for people in communities. And again, I'd say some of the work we're thinking about as part of missions is about trying to think what's the overarching aim here and how do we wrap ourselves around that together.
My lady, one follow-up question, if I may. Given the inevitable pressures on an array of services and the difficulties that you've described of trying to pull in support from Test and Trace or the Army, whoever it may be, is it quite important, do you think, in pandemic planning to try and think through and have some sort of designated responsibilities for who is going to support schools in some of these, the public health elements of a response, if I can call it that, rather than the Department for Education trying to create a very difficult solution in the moment, as it were?
Yes, I mean, I hope it's been clear throughout that I'm in favour of more planning on nearly everything. I think it can be very difficult to make a detailed plan that is going to respond to every possible version of an emergency that you might face, but I think you can create building blocks that are likely to be widely deployable. And I also think we've got to be realistic about the extent to which, in a health-driven emergency, the people who do health might be quite busy. And so I think there might be something about having a standing expectation and a set of variations to that tell you what to do if your plan A isn't available.
Thank you. My lady, my question on ventilation has, I think, been covered already, so I won't
Thank you
cover the
very
same
much,
ground.
Mr
Thank you.
Jacobs. And Ms Douglas, who's there, I think. Yep.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms Ackland-Hood. I appear on behalf of CVF. CVF represents both clinically vulnerable children and children living in households with a clinically vulnerable family member. And you were asked this morning about absenteeism, and you touched on the work that's being done to turn the corner on rates of persistent and severe absence, which rose during the pandemic. You've explained in a little more detail in your witness statement about how the Department for Education monitors data on differences in attendance across pupil subgroups or with different characteristics. In CVF's experience, persistent and severe absence from school has been significantly higher among children in clinically vulnerable families than the national average, or indeed other vulnerable groups, including children eligible for free school meals or with education, health and care plans. I note that there is precedent for new data collection in this context, and I think we've seen that in relation to absence rates among young carers. Would it be helpful to collect and monitor data on the levels of attendance and reasons for absence among clinically vulnerable children and children in clinically vulnerable families?
I think that's a good question, and it's definitely something we could take away and think about. I think the challenge would be that so at various points during the pandemic, we saw the definition of who was considered to be clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable change over time. And I think sometimes people continue to feel vulnerable, including clinically vulnerable, when they didn't quite meet that designation as was being set out by the health authorities. And so I think there'd be something about I am not sure how far there is a stable health definition that you could use, particularly in the context where it depends what you're vulnerable to.
I appreciate that there are a challenge perhaps in comparison to data on a child that's eligible for free school meals, for example. But I think that just by way of contrast with young carers, that data relies on sort of self-reporting and declarations by parents or guardians. So perhaps there's a bit of a precedent there for collecting that kind of data.
Yeah, it's certainly something we could look at.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Douglas. Secretary, that completes the questions we have for you. It's been extremely helpful, and you've obviously put in not just a great deal of thought, but a great deal of work in preparing for today. And I'm really grateful to you and to all your colleagues who obviously helped, including the poor soul that put in all those tabs in your file.
It's a team effort, the tabs. Thank
But
you.
no, I am genuinely grateful to you all for your help.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Traynor.
My lady, the final witness today is Derek Baker.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
I hope you haven't been waiting for too long.
No, thank you.
Mr. Baker, good afternoon. Thank you for your attendance today and for the provision of your witness statement dated the 28th of August 2025, which is at INQ 000 588 169. I think you should have that in front of you.
I do. I
And can
don't
you
have it on
confirm-
the screen.
Pardon?
I don't have it on the screen, but I do
Oh,
have
yes,
hard
you have
copy.
a hard copy.
Yes.
Great. And can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, you were the Permanent Secretary to the Department of Education in Northern Ireland from February 2017 until your retirement on the 27th of November 2020, correct?
Correct.
And throughout your time, the Minister of Education was Lord Weir, who had been appointed in January 2020 when power sharing was restored. Is that right?
Correct.
And my lady, you will recall having heard evidence from Lord Weir in the course of Module 2C. But Mr. Baker, Lord Weir was later succeeded by Ms McElveen, then in June 2021. Is that
Correct.
right? And in terms of your successors as Permanent Secretary, I understand that Leanne Patterson partially covered the role between November 2020 and February 2021. Mark Brown was then in post from March 2021 until December 2024, and Ronnie Armour has been acting Permanent Secretary since December 2024. Is that correct?
Correct.
And in light of that, Mr. Baker, at the outset, I'd like to just take a moment to set out the sequence of events which has preceded your attendance to give evidence today. Initially, the Department of Education had provided a witness statement signed by the current Acting Permanent Secretary, Mr. Armour, and he was invited to give evidence. The Department then wrote to the inquiry advising that during the specified period, Mr. Armour was the Director General of the Northern Ireland Prison Service and that you and Mr. Brown would be better placed to give evidence. And following careful consideration and mindful that you had retired from the civil service, the inquiry then invited Mr. Brown to attend and give evidence. But the Department then wrote to the inquiry again, advising that Mr. Brown was unable to attend. And having made further inquiries and following careful consideration, the inquiry then invited you to give evidence. So, Mr. Baker, that sets out the basis upon which you're being put forward as a witness by the Department. Is that correct?
I wasn't privy to all of that correspondence, but I understand it to be the case.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Baker, at the outset, I'd like to ask you a bit about the role of the Department of Education in Northern Ireland in relation to children and young people, because I think there are some important differences as compared with England, Scotland and Wales. So the Department of Education is one of 9 Northern Ireland executive departments, and we understand from your statement that responsibilities in relation to children and young people sit across virtually all of those departments. Is that right?
Some aspects of responsibility for children, legislation and policy in respect of children, straddle the interests of quite a few departments. That's correct, yes.
What particular responsibilities does the Department of Education hold in relation to children and young people?
The Department of Education has policy and legislative responsibility for three broad areas. One is children's education in primary and post-primary, but no responsibility for further and higher education. It has responsibility for youth services, and it has responsibility for childcare. And all of those matters are devolved to the Northern Ireland administration. So whilst we would have regard to what is happening in other jurisdictions, we have full responsibility for all of those issues.
And I think it's right that the Department of Education would have overall responsibility and accountability for the quality of education in schools.
It does.
Right? And just so that it is clear, in contrast to the position in England, the Department of Education in Northern Ireland does not have any responsibility for children's social care. In Northern Ireland, that sits with the Department of Health, isn't that right?
Correct.
And again, in Northern Ireland, unlike in England, Scotland and Wales, local authorities have no role in the provision of education.
Correct.
Now, Mr. Baker, I'd like to begin by looking at the department's pre-pandemic planning with you. In your statement, and this is at paragraph 569 for your reference, you acknowledge that the department failed to identify as a risk the possibility of schools suddenly having to close. And you explain that that was because, and I quote, officials considered that such a prospect seemed too apocalyptic to be realistically included in a risk register. And you say that as a consequence, officials had to react urgently to an entirely unforeseen and extreme set of circumstances. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And Mr. Baker, I think you accept in your statement that the department had done very limited planning for an emergency of this scale prior to 2020. Is that correct?
Yes, I would fully accept that the department was neither psychologically nor practically prepared for huge swathes of the education system closing down in March 2020.
And you make the point in your statement that the only prior planning and testing was in respect of bird flu or human influenza planning, which was pre-January 2020. Is that right?
It was a long time before that, actually. I think the guidance was issued in 2009, 2010. But I would not wish to place any particular store by that guidance in respect of the COVID crisis which befell us in 2020.
May I ask why, Mr. Baker?
Because I think the previous flu guidance that was issued in 2009, 2010 anticipated at worst perhaps individual schools having to close periodically for a short period, but it did not foresee in any respect the circumstances which we faced in March 2020 with whole swathes of the education system closing down. So I think in many respects, that bird flu guidance was irrelevant to the COVID-19 crisis.
Okay, well, perhaps we can take a look at the pandemic flu plans that the department held prior to 2020. If we could have on screen, please, INQ 000 617 116. I'm just pausing at the cover page. Mr. Baker, this is a Department of Education document, correct?
Yes.
And we can see that it's a contingency plan for both the department itself and for the wider education sector, so for schools and education settings.
Yes.
Is that right? And in your statement, you explain, and this is at paragraph 80, that schools and arm's length bodies are responsible for contingency planning in their respective roles. But I think it's right that ultimately the department has oversight of that contingency planning. Is that correct?
I think for any contingency planning that relates to system-wide emergencies, you're absolutely right. The department should be taking the lead in such emergency planning. Individual schools would have responsibility for issues which would affect them on an individual basis, such as an exceptional closure, issues maybe such as a burst pipe, such as snow, such as bad weather, or an outbreak of some particular disease. But at a system-wide level, it would be for the Department of Education and the Education Authority.
That's helpful, thank you. Now, Mr. Baker, the department has provided this plan to the inquiry in draft form, and in your statement, you explain that this is the version that was held within the department at the time prior to January 2020. But I don't think that we need to be too concerned about this plan being a draft. If we could look at the box in the bottom, thank you, in the bottom right-hand side of the screen, we can see that this is version 6 and that it had been issued in December 2017. Is that right?
I would question that, and I do apologise to the inquiry for that, because I made some inquiries myself, having read the Department's corporate witness statement again, whilst a final version was produced in 2009, 2010. Subsequent to that, my understanding is that it was being revised in the Department, and there was a revision underway in 2017, as shown on the screen, but that never was completed, to the best of my knowledge.
I see. But this is guidance, and we will see some track changes throughout where perhaps revisions were intended, but this is guidance that nevertheless had been issued at
in
some point.
2009-10, yes,
Yes.
correct.
Okay, and perhaps if we could look at page 20 of this, please. So this is a section entitled Possible or Probable Closure of Schools. And if we look at paragraph 20.1, it suggests that schools may be an exception to the general business as usual message that underpins government guidance to other sectors in relation to a pandemic, because there are specific issues to consider concerning children, yes?
Yeah.
And if we could look at paragraph 20.4, please. This paragraph says that schools have been advised to plan both for staying open during a pandemic and for the possible closure to children of schools if the government proposes such closure at a national level. It suggests that closure could either be very localised and brief or more widespread and for a longer period, depending on national public health advice.
Yeah.
So we see here, Mr. Baker, schools being advised to plan both for staying open and for possible closures. Was the department's own internal planning also predicated on the basis that you may need to plan for both eventualities?
It's difficult to answer that question because I'm not sure the department had any internal planning for any of these eventualities. I think the key point in that advice is that it's contingent on public health advice coming to the education sector. And I have to say, at that time, in February, early March 2020, there was no public health advice that the department was aware of that indicated that we should prepare for the whole-scale closure of the education system.
May I just ask you about that, Mr. Baker, before we continue to look at this document? What scientific advice or briefings was the Department of Education receiving from the Department of Health in that initial period?
Through the month of February, when COVID started to become an issue, there was considerable engagement between the Department of Health and the Public Health Agency on one hand and the Department of Education on the other. And I think the inquiry has at its disposal a kind of chronology of events affecting education during that period. And you will note that during the month of February, a number of pieces of guidance were issued to the education sector, but mainly about public health issues, about social distancing, about keeping safe, about isolation. The contacts with the Department of Health were really about staying safe in the context of a pandemic. But there was no engagement with the Department of Health or with the Chief Medical Officer, either directly or through the medium of the Executive Committee, that's the equivalent of the Cabinet of Ministers, which suggested that we needed to prepare for the eventuality of closing the education system.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Before we leave this document, there are a few more paragraphs that I would like to take you to. If we could look at paragraph 20.5, please. So this paragraph appears to expressly recognise the impact of school closures for those we would come to know as key workers. Yes?
Yes.
And if we look at paragraph 22.2, we see here express acknowledgement that if schools in the Republic of Ireland were to close because the pandemic had arrived, schools in Northern Ireland may need to close even if there were no cases at that stage. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
And if we could look at paragraph 26.1, please. The first sentence of this paragraph acknowledges the possibility of multiple waves in a pandemic, possibly weeks or months apart, yes?
Yes.
I'm almost there. If we could look at paragraph 28.1, please. This paragraph relates to remote learning. And it says that this is an area that needs further work because during a pandemic, it might not be possible to provide the usual full education service for children if children were unable to attend school. And it says at the last sentence that plans to provide remote learning could include the possible use of online material where pupils have internet access. So whilst not setting out any detailed plan, recognising here the possibility of a need to educate children in their homes in the event of a pandemic. Yes?
Yes.
And then finally, at paragraph 28.3, this paragraph says that the department will need to consider what scope there is to provide curricular support at a national level in the event of school closures. This issue had been mentioned in the schools guidance with an indication that further advice will issue in due course. Mr. Baker, to your recollection, did the department ever issue any further advice on remote education to schools prior to March 2020?
To the best of my recollection, it didn't. And I would have to concede to the inquiry that when COVID struck in March 2020, I wasn't even aware of the existence of this guidance.
How can that be, Mr. Baker, when this was Department of Education guidance that had been produced by departmental officials?
I think that would be explained simply by loss of corporate memory. I think everybody who might have been in a position of authority when the guidance was originally produced in 2009-10 and issued had probably moved on, and that those who had been working on redrafting it had moved on. But it certainly wasn't drawn to my attention that it existed when I took up post in 2017 and through the COVID period.
And Mr. Baker, I think in an earlier answer you had suggested that the guidance was being revised in 2017.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, that wasn't something you were aware of at the time.
I wasn't aware of it, and I don't think that process was concluded.
Okay. Now, Mr. Baker, earlier I referred you to the suggestion in your statement that officials had to react to an entirely unforeseen set of circumstances. It might be suggested that this plan had rather accurately forecast the circumstances that the department would face in March 2020 in the course of COVID-19. Would you agree with that?
I wouldn't entirely agree with it. I think the set of circumstances which we faced in 2020, in which, and I'll use the shorthand phrase, school closures, couldn't really have been anticipated. I think the flu guidance to which you're referring was more likely to be focusing on individual schools having to close, but the whole-scale closure of the education system was, in my view, wholly unprecedented and wholly unforeseen and unpredicted by anybody. And, I say that, and forgive me, I didn't mean to cut across you there, but I did reflect on this point at the time, but more recently when I knew that I was going to be invited to give evidence. And I looked back over the minutes of various fora which existed at that time and where one might have expected such circumstances to be predicted, like departmental board minutes, the minutes of our weekly meetings with the Minister, and probably most importantly, the minutes of the weekly meetings that all permanent secretaries had, where we ranged over and discussed issues of common interest. And right through the period January, February and into early March 2020, there was no hint or suggestion that we were facing into the whole-scale closure of large elements of society. COVID was certainly on the agenda, but it was very much in the context of its being a health-related issue, which was going to place huge pressures on the health service, but nobody was gearing up for closure of other sectors of society, be that hospitality, tourism, business, public transport and education.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. And for completeness, if we could perhaps just quickly scroll through to the end of this section at page 27, we can see that there is some brief mention of headline issues. So boarding schools, special schools, exams, recovery arrangements.
Yeah.
What we don't see in this document, Mr. Baker, is any consideration of the potential impact of school closures on children themselves. Is that right?
Sorry, I haven't got the particular paragraph in front of me. Which paragraph are you referring to, please?
I'm referring to the document generally,
the
Mr.
document as a
Baker.
whole? Sorry.
We can check it afterwards.
Yeah.
But I think you can take it from me that there is
That's
no...
okay. That's okay. I won't argue with you.
I'm grateful. That can come down, thank you. Now, Mr. Baker, I think you suggest in your statement that it was the department's expectation that schools would have had plans for possible closure based on this plan that we've just looked at, and this is paragraph 115. Beyond the guidance that we've just looked at, did the department have more detailed plans that schools could take and implement, or was it rather a case that the individual schools would have to come up with those plans themselves?
I think the expectation would have been that individual schools should have their own business continuity plans to deal with things like exceptional closures, but that would have been the height of it. Certainly, I would not have expected schools to have plans in place for the long-term closure of the education system.
So those plans would have been for things like inclement weather?
Yes, yes, I agree.
And Mr. Baker, I think it's right that on the 9th of March 2020, the Minister asked officials to seek assurance from the department's arm's length bodies that they had appropriate contingency plans in place. Firstly, can you help us with that? Contingency plans for what?
Now, could you please help me? Did he say contingency plans or did he say business continuity plans?
Contingency plans.
Did he? I think what he was referring to were the business continuity plans, which every body corporate has to have in place, and they were largely internal documents for the department and its arm's length bodies. If, for example, we had staff going off on sickness absence, or for some reason we could not use our own premises. But I don't think it related to the wider education system closing down. And we did actually ask our arm's length bodies if they were gearing up for the possibility of losing staff through sickness to COVID. And we also dusted down our own major emergency response plan and business continuity plan, which we eventually had to activate on, I think, the 19th of March.
Yes. And you mentioned there that you did speak to the arm's length bodies. To what extent was the department assured through that process that children and young people would have continued access to education throughout the pandemic?
No, I would not want to suggest for one moment that we had assurance that children and young people would continue to have access during the COVID period. And I think we always made it clear, and I would refer to our opening statement, which Council submitted to the inquiry when he quoted, I think, what we said to the Education Committee of the Assembly on the 18th of March, the day the announcement was made, that the closure of schools was simply a bad thing. There was nothing positive about it. And the best that we were in was mitigation of these very negative circumstances. Remote teaching and learning and the closure of schools was no substitute in any way for classroom-based learning. It was always going to be a very, very second best, and we acknowledge that in our guidance to schools. It could never be a substitute for classroom-based learning.
Mr. Baker, I will come on to look at those mitigations with you, but before we do, I'd like to ask you a bit about the department's role in the closure of schools and that decision.
Yeah.
If we could have on screen, please, INQ 000 289 859. Mr. Baker, on the 12th of March, you attended an all ministers and all permanent secretaries meeting, which had been called in response to the Taoiseach's announcement that schools in the Republic of Ireland were closing. And if we could zoom in on the box at the bottom, we can see that at that time the Health Minister wasn't recommending the closure of schools, but that the sage advice that when school closures are considered appropriate, it should be for 15 weeks was being conveyed. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
And if we could look over the page, please. And if we could look at the last paragraph, we see a contribution from you, Mr. Baker. You say 300,000 plus children in schools. Any decision would need to include primary and post-primary. Childcare implications huge for local economy. Power to close schools in place and can be used at any stage. biggest issue impact on exams and consideration of those eligible for free school meals. So this is a discussion, it seems, Mr Baker, about the impact of a potential decision to close schools in Northern Ireland, is that right?
Not entirely. I recall the meeting. I don't actually remember contributing to the meeting, but it was over 5.5 years ago. I can't remember exactly what I said, but there was a very robust discussion amongst ministers about the fact that schools had closed in the Republic of Ireland and whether or not that had any implications for Northern Ireland, and that's correct. But there was no clear agreement amongst ministers as to whether that should influence the decision in Northern Ireland whether or not to close. And I do recall from that discussion that the First Minister, the Health Minister, the Education Minister and the Chief Medical Officer were adamant that schools should not close.
Yes, Mr Baker, I don't mean to suggest that any decision was made at this meeting, but when we see a reference to any decision needing to include primary and post-primary, that is a decision about a potential closure of schools. Is that correct?
It was a discussion about a potential decision, but I can confirm that the notion that schools might be closed was dismissed by the various individuals whom I've just listed.
Yes.
And the policy to the department was very clear: schools stay open.
Perhaps we'll come back to that policy, but I think it's right that your key concerns, certainly at this point, were the impact of any potential decision on exams and on free school meals. Is that right?
I honestly can't confirm that because I don't remember what I said. I mean, I would say that the note of that meeting, I think, is a very shorthand note of what was a very long and robust discussion. So I'm not going to demur from what is recorded there. If I said that, I said that. I may have said more than that. I can't really confirm otherwise. It is too long ago for me to remember. I'm sorry.
Okay. And jumping slightly forward then, that document can come down, thank you, to the decision to close schools. In your statement, you have said that until the First and Deputy First Minister's announcement of school closures on the 18th of March, it was the Department of Education's understanding that schools would remain open. Are we to understand from that, Mr Baker, that the Department of Education was taken off guard by the decision to close schools in Northern Ireland?
Yes. And I was taken off guard.
Okay, and the inquiry is aware from Module 2C that on the 16th of March, so 2 days before that announcement, the Executive Committee had voted in favour of closing schools, essentially when the Chief Medical Officer advised that it was appropriate. Were officials in the department aware of that decision at the time?
Not on the 16th of March, no.
So is it your evidence, Mr Baker, that the first that the department learned of this decision was through the media, essentially, at the same time?
No, I was probably informed of it towards the late afternoon or evening of the 17th of March, which was a public holiday with us, St Patrick's Day, as you know.
And Mr Baker, the Minister of Education was at that meeting and had participated in that vote. Why would officials in the department not have been aware?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, perhaps we can look at what you've said about the department's position at that time. If we could have on screen, please, paragraph 108 of Mr Baker's statement, page 29. So, Mr Baker, you've said here that the department hadn't been informed that schools would be closing prior to the announcement we've discussed, whilst an indication had been given that schools may have to close in the future. Pausing there, when was it first indicated to the Department of Education that there may be a need to close schools in Northern Ireland?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, there was this discussion amongst ministers on the 12th of March. I think that was a Thursday. And it came as a bit of a shock to everybody, I think, when the Republic of Ireland announced that they were closing schools. So I think that was the first time it ever entered our consciousness that something like this could conceivably be possible. But the clear direction following that meeting was that schools should stay open. And that was still the position when we got to Monday the 16th. And it was only during the course of the 17th that suddenly it became apparent that there could be an announcement that schools would close.
Okay. And you continue here that the public announcement of closures came within days of schools being made aware of the potential. Is that a reference of the Minister's letter to schools of the 16th of March?
It is.
Okay. And you say then, whilst the department and schools were starting to build resilience into plans, the sudden announcement by the executive did not allow sufficient time for this work to be fully completed. Can you help us with what that means, Mr. Baker? What does it mean to build resilience into plans?
I had mentioned, well, you quoted the notes of the meeting that had taken place earlier with ministers and the comments that I made about free school meals, for example, and examinations. At that time, and it was only days before the announcement was made, I know that some of my colleagues in the department were starting to think, what will we do about public examinations, the summer 2020 exam series, for example, if schools close or if we are not able to hold examinations the way we normally do? We were also thinking about how best could we deliver free school meals. But I would have to confirm that we were in no more than the foothills of considering those issues when the announcement was made on the 18th of March.
And just moving slightly further down the paragraph, you say that department officials did not give specific advice on whether schools should be closed, nor were plans drawn up in the eventuality that all schools would close. Department officials were not involved in the decision to close schools or the timing of the announcement, as you've said. Mr. Baker, stepping back, we have the 2017 plan, which had conceived of a potential need to close schools, possibly at national level, possibly on more than one occasion, possibly for a long time. On the 11th of March, the World Health Organization had declared COVID-19 a pandemic. On the 12th of March, the Republic of Ireland had closed its schools, and you were in that meeting at which the SAGE advice was conveyed. The Minister had written to schools to advise them that there was a possibility that schools in Northern Ireland may need to close. Why would the Department of Education not have drawn up plans in the eventuality that schools would need to close by that point?
Schools would only have closed for one reason and one reason only, and that is if the Department of Education and the Minister of Education had received clear and unequivocal public health advice that schools should close effectively to save lives. No such advice was received in that period. You mentioned the meeting that took place on the 16th. Schools closed 4 working days after that. I really don't think there was time to make proper preparations for the closure of schools in that period. It would never have been enough.
And Mr. Baker, throughout the course of your evidence, you have said that the department was operating on the basis that schools would remain open and that that had been the department's position until the 18th of March when this announcement was made. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So where do we see the department's plans for schools remaining open that have been made in that period between January and March the 18th?
I don't quite understand. A plan to remain open, that was the status quo, supplemented by the public health advice, which had already been issued to schools about staying safe, issues around distancing, issues around cleansing of equipment and so forth, issues around isolation. So the advice to schools was in and around public health advice. But we didn't have a separate plan for schools staying open because that was de facto the status quo.
So in that sense, it was business as usual, was really...
Well, it wasn't business as usual because obviously schools had received a lot of advice and were receiving a lot of advice from the Public Health Agency as to how they could stay safe and above all, how pupils and staff could stay safe.
And given that the Department of Education has a role in overseeing schools' contingency plans, where was the Department of Education at that time in terms of assisting schools with implementing the guidance they were receiving? Did the department have a role prior to the 18th of March?
I don't think the department would have a role in assisting individual schools to implement guidance. I'm not really too sure how we could have done that. There are over
Mr. Baker, I'm sorry to cut across you. It's not individual schools, it's all schools in Northern Ireland.
Yes, but there are 1,000 schools in Northern Ireland. I don't think the department would ever have been in a position to assist 1,000 schools to implement public health guidance. That was a matter for school leadership teams to do themselves and make sure that they were compliant complying with the guidance issued by the Public Health Agency, the department could really not have gone into schools and marked their homework in that. I don't think so.
Okay. My lady, I know that we are a few moments off the break. This might be a convenient place.
Of course, certainly. I shall return at 3:10.
Thank you.
All rise. Dr. Trina.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Baker, I promised to return to the issue of mitigations with you. So we'll start by looking at the first mitigation that the department introduced, which was the policy of operating school clusters so that vulnerable children could attend. At the point of the decision to close schools, what level of understanding did the Department of Education have about the likely numbers of vulnerable children who might be attending school?
We didn't have any real information about how many children would attend, either vulnerable children or the children of key workers. We just did not know. So, well, I don't want to proceed to answer another question, but the concept of clusters was a contingency in case some schools closed and there would be no school or educational institution in a particular locality. To provide a base for the children of key workers or vulnerable children. You'll understand that in Northern Ireland we have some exceptionally small schools with maybe only 2 or 3 teachers. So if those teachers were ill or shielding or vulnerable, those schools could have closed in their entirety. So we needed to put in place some kind of contingency arrangements to make sure that there was a home for those pupils in every locality. Although in the event, clusters did not become an important feature of keeping some schools open for vulnerable children. I think at any given time, according to the daily information that we receive from schools, there were never more than about 30 or so clusters in Northern Ireland, and that's set against typically 400 schools being open on any given day.
And Mr. Baker, I'll ask you in a moment about the numbers of children who were attending. But before I do, just on the point of data, you've indicated that really the department, I think you'd said, had no real information about the numbers of vulnerable children. I do see at tab 5, this is, I'll not put it up on the screen, but for the transcript, it's at INQ *0087625, and it's at page 3. The minutes of a contingency planning update meeting on the 19th of March. And in the course of that meeting, it suggested that 156,000 children were expected to be accommodated, with an additional approximate 17,000 statemented children and 6,000 social work related. Can I ask you, what was the basis for those figures? Do you know where they came from?
Well, the latter 2 figures that you mentioned, I think, are self-explanatory. The first figure, I think, would have related to the total number of children in receipt of free school meals, which we were using as an extremely loose proxy for potentially vulnerable children. But at that stage, we had absolutely no idea how many children might attend schools during this period.
And the former Children's Commissioner for Northern Ireland has made the point that during the pandemic, there was a considerable lack of disaggregated data available on children by age or other characteristics that made them particularly vulnerable. So, for example, disability or care experience.
Yeah.
Do you recognise those sorts of gaps in Northern Ireland's data collation?
We issued a survey every day to all schools, asking schools which schools are open, how many pupils are attending, how many teaching staff are attending, how many non-teaching staff are attending. And that was broken down by phase: preschool, primary school, post-primary, special school, and so forth. And occasionally we supplemented those daily surveys with information about vulnerable pupils. So we would have up-to-date data for the top management in the department and the Minister about what was happening out there. But I fully accept the comments by the former Children's Commissioner that we didn't go right down into disaggregating the data by all kinds of different vulnerable children. I think from our guidance on vulnerable children, we identified 12 different categories of vulnerable children, and we certainly didn't ask schools to fill in that data on a daily basis. I think in due course, school leaders and school principals found the imposition of a daily survey quite difficult, given all the other things that they were having to cope with. And later in the crisis, we reduced the daily survey maybe to a weekly survey.
And Mr. Baker, I just want to clarify something you said in the course of that answer. I think you said that that survey data was broken down by primary, secondary, special school. But in your statement at paragraph 78, and this is on page 21, just for your reference, you said that the survey of pupil attendance was issued to all educational settings from the 23rd of March 2020 to the 29th of June 2020, but that a breakdown by school setting type was not possible. Can I just clarify whether it was possible to break that down by setting?
I am bemused by that because I have actually seen copies of the reports, and I do apologise if in any way we have misled the inquiry, but the breakdown does show individual phases of schools.
And in your statement, you also point up data quality issues in relation to those survey responses. Is it right that there were issues with the quality of that data in terms of the ability to validate it?
There were, and I did probe that again on rereading the corporate witness statement, and we engaged with our statisticians. We were getting daily returns via the Education Authority from schools, as I've just explained. Our statisticians are quite precious about the quality of data, and they want to make sure that everything is properly validated. And I think there was one field in the data which sometimes wasn't properly completed, and they were concerned about that, and they felt that that could call into question some of the validity of the data, but that was fixed after a week of the daily surveys, I'm given to understand. I don't think it was a major issue, but the daily survey would not have measured up to the kite mark of official national statistics, which, as you know, our statisticians are quite precious about.
Yes, so is it your position then that, notwithstanding any limitations, that data was sufficiently robust to allow the department to rely upon it for planning in this context?
Well, I think it was more for reporting and knowing what was happening out there. And we used that data to feed through to the Central Civil Contingencies Group in the Executive Office, who also wanted to produce daily reports for ministers and for the Executive as to what was happening outside in the world in terms of, business and how many people were moving around and what was happening in schools. So I think for the times that we're in it, that daily survey was sufficient for that purpose.
Okay, and a few minutes ago, Mr. Baker, you mentioned that the numbers of vulnerable children attending school in Northern Ireland were very low. Was that an intended outcome?
No, it wasn't. And the Minister was actually concerned about that, and I think the inquiry has evidence of a letter that the Minister sent to schools to remind them that he was concerned by the low numbers of vulnerable children attending school, and he urged school leaders to get in touch with the parents of vulnerable children to make sure that they were aware that schools were open to provide services for them. I think that probably given the overriding message that was coming from the government at the very the most senior levels, from the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom down, which was stay at home to stay safe, it was very difficult simultaneously to be encouraging the parents of some children to send them to schools. I think everybody followed the predominant message, stay at home, whereas we were trying to encourage some parents to send their children to schools, and that was a difficult tension, there's no question.
Could we have on screen, please, INQ 000308437 at page 19, and it's the message from Mr. Baker at the bottom I'd like to look at. Mr. Baker, this is a WhatsApp message from you to the PSS COVID-19 group chat. I think this comprises the attendees of the Permanent Secretary's stocktake meeting, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you say here that anecdotally, the key worker arrangements in education settings are operating generally without major incidents. The last resort messaging over the weekend appears to have worked, and numbers in individual settings are low and manageable. For example, a 1,350 pupil school in South Down has 6 pupils and 17 staff attending. Neighbouring 500 pupil school has 0 pupils, and it continues to discuss data collation issues. You've said here, Mr Baker, that the last resort messaging seems to have worked. Worked in what sense, Mr Baker, if not to keep the numbers of children attending school low and manageable?
That is exactly what it was intended to do. I think you need to go back to the context at the time. We, as soon as it was announced that schools were closing, we had pretty intensive discussions with the teaching unions, who obviously were very concerned about safety of pupils and indeed their own members, and pressed us very hard on what we meant by schools remaining open for the children of key workers in particular. There was quite a long list of key professions whose children needed to be accommodated, and I think the teaching professions were concerned that schools would open and very large numbers of pupils would attend, and naturally enough there was a fear factor around that. So it was a relief to us that when schools did open, low numbers of the children of key workers actually did attend, and it didn't impose a burden on the schools themselves or create a major safety risk. So as far as I was concerned, and I think the Minister was concerned, and the teaching unions were concerned, that was a positive outcome. I think the context of this particular comment is about the children of key workers and not vulnerable children.
I see. Thank you. And can I just clarify then, Mr Baker, had the department set any internal target or maximum number of children who could safely attend school?
No. That was left to individual school leaders because the logistics in every school are different. It depends on the premises, the size of the building and so forth, and who and how many could be safely accommodated. So we weren't going to set a target of 5%, 10%, 50%. I think that would have been wholly inappropriate.
And you made clear in your answer a moment ago that the focus was really on the children of key workers and their attendance at school and keeping that manageable. Is that correct?
That particular comment that you referenced, yes, but it was made clear that schools were to remain open for the children of key workers and for vulnerable children. And the Minister did press that latter point in his letter to all school principals.
Now, Mr Baker, I won't turn it up. For your reference, it is at tab 10 of your bundle. And for the transcript, it's at INQ 000617935. And this is the Department's 31st of March 2020 guidance on COVID-19 clusters. And in that guidance, it makes it clear that the provision in hubs was for those key workers who had no alternative. Is that an example of the last resort messaging you were referring to just a moment ago in the message that we looked at?
No, I think the reference to clustering is about making sure that there was somewhere for those children to go if all of the other schools in the locality
Sorry,
were
Mr
closed.
Baker, I perhaps didn't phrase that
apologies.
correctly. My question was rather about whether this was an example of the last resort messaging that you referred to in that exchange.
Could you remind me what the exchange was? I don't have it on the screen in front of me.
Oh, could we
please.
have back on screen, please, INQ 000308437 at page 19. Thank you. So you refer here, Mr Baker, to the last resort messaging.
Yes. Yeah.
And if you look at tab 10 of your bundle, so the clustering guidance that I referred to, it says this service is only for those key workers who are unable to find a viable alternative option.
That's correct.
So that is a reference
It is.
to that
It
messaging.
is. Thank you. Yeah.
And just on that guidance, Mr Baker, while we're here, on its face, it purports to address both the children of key workers and vulnerable children. And I think when you look at it, you look at the substance of the guidance, it really seems to focus on key workers, which I think is aligned with what you've just said. But my question to you is, do you think that there's a risk that that last resort type of messaging may have, even if inadvertently, dissuaded vulnerable families from making use of the provision that was being made for their children?
I don't think so, because the Minister made it absolutely clear to all school principals that he wanted them to consider very carefully the position of vulnerable children, of whom they were aware. And schools would have been aware of vulnerable children. It's what they do. They have a designated teacher to look after the interests of vulnerable children, and he was encouraging school principals to reach out to those families to ensure vulnerable children knew that they could attend schools.
Well, I'll move on then, Mr. Baker, to the second mitigation, which is the provision of remote learning. I think consistent with the evidence that it hadn't planned for closures, before schools closed, the Department of Education had not carried out any assessment of how schools could deliver remote learning. Is that right?
That's correct.
And prior to March 2020, the department hadn't undertaken work to regulate or develop standards for remote learning. Is that right?
That's correct.
And Mr. Baker, given that the plan that we looked at, and accepting all of the caveats around the pandemic influenza plan, but given that it had identified school closures as a possibility and pointed to a potential need to deliver online learning to children in the event of mass school closures, why would that sort of assessment or planning for delivery of remote education not have been done?
Notwithstanding the earlier guidance, the simple fact is that remote teaching and learning was simply not part of the education system in Northern Ireland or anywhere else, so far as I knew. It simply wasn't what we did. There was never any requirement for schools to maintain a parallel online or digital learning system. They didn't do it, and we wouldn't have expected schools to do that. I think to have maintained such a system could have been extremely expensive, and it would have required a lot of time and effort, but it simply wasn't part of our system. It's not how teaching and learning was done.
And on the 10th of May, the Education Authority initially estimated the number of devices required across schools in Northern Ireland to be around 11,500. And in your statement, and this is at paragraph 237, you have confirmed that no devices had been allocated to children prior to the 22nd of May 2020. Mr. Baker, schools had closed in March. Why, given the pressing need that had been identified, had no devices been allocated to children before the end of May?
Well, I don't think that's quite right. We're talking about two different things here. Many schools had their own devices which they distributed to their pupils. Many pupils had their own devices at home, which they could use. Schools had one-to-one device schemes, which they were able to use to give to pupils. So I think what you're talking about is the procurement of additional devices, which the department undertook as a project on foot of some work that it did with all schools, to assess what the need was for pupils who couldn't get access to either their own devices at home or devices which were lent by individual schools. So the project to procure devices was based on that submission and got underway at that point. And I think ultimately, by the end of 2021 or midway through 2021, about almost 25,000 devices were procured and distributed at a cost to the department of £5 million. But schools were already lending their own devices. We were a little bit concerned at the start that maybe all schools were not lending all of their devices. They might have been a little bit reluctant to do so for whatever reason, but again, we encouraged them to do so. There needed to be a little bit of work done occasionally before you would distribute devices to pupils to make sure that they were properly configured to make them safe, and that could hold things up from time to time. But I don't think it's right to say that no devices were distributed before May 2020.
Mr. Baker, that is what you have said in your statement at paragraph, at paragraph 237. You said that no devices had been allocated to children prior to the 22nd of May.
I think, well, schools were already distributing their own devices to children. I apologise again if that is misleading. I think what we're talking about there is devices distributed on foot of the project to procure and distribute additional devices over and above those held by schools.
I do appreciate the distinction you're making, Mr. Baker, but is it not the case that the reason there was a need for that procurement exercise was that schools couldn't meet the need themselves through the loan of devices?
Absolutely, and we established that need through the work that was done with every school. During the course, I think it was, of April 2020, the Education Authority engaged with all schools and asked them, right, how many devices do you need and for which pupils? And the culmination of that work was the submission I think you're referring to of May 2020.
Okay, and moving on then, Mr. Baker, you also explained that it was not until July 2020, which is after the school term had finished, that the department launched a scheme to provide free Wi-Fi and mobile connectivity. Does it follow from that, Mr. Baker, that a number of the children who had been allocated devices prior to that point will still nevertheless have been unable to engage in online learning because they didn't have internet access?
Yes, I think that's a fair assumption to make. You will be aware of the remote nature of parts of Northern Ireland where a Wi-Fi connection is difficult, and we realised that in addition to making sure that devices were distributed, we would have to assist some families or some specific pupils to gain access to Wi-Fi. And we worked with companies like British Telecom to try and support that, and I think over the course of the next year about 10,000 solutions were issued, such as, Wi-Fi vouchers and so forth, to assist connectivity for such pupils.
But was that gap between the provision of devices and the provision of Wi-Fi, was that something that the department had appreciated at the time, that they were making the devices available?
I think the department appreciated that there were definitely going to be connectivity gaps in Northern Ireland, but by the time we had negotiated arrangements with British Telecom and so forth to set up the schemes of assistance, it took some time.
Thank you. Now, it has been suggested, Mr. Baker, that some children in Northern Ireland still did not have access to the equipment they needed during the second set of school closures in 2021. Can you help us to understand why it had not been possible to address the level of need by that stage?
I do know that there had been an order placed for additional devices, which was expected to be delivered in September 2020, but for reasons of supply and demand, and you will appreciate that it seemed at that stage that the whole world was chasing after the same devices. They did not get delivered until early in 2021, and that delayed our ability to distribute some devices. But there was a market supply and demand problem for devices. Even the whole civil service was looking for devices, the public sector and the private sector. So it just wasn't easy to get all of the supply that you wanted immediately when you wanted it. We went through standard public procurement procedures. We might have short-circuited those, but I have to say that my colleagues in the department were protecting me as the accounting officer through the procurement of that. There have been procurement issues around some of the issues during COVID, but we went through sort of Crown Commercial Services framework contract to get these things as fast as we could, and it didn't always happen.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Baker, I understand from your statement also that the department wasn't monitoring the quality or amount of online learning taking place. Is that correct?
Yes and no. And I know that's not the answer you want to hear. We did not. The way that we in the department would monitor and assess the quality of teaching and learning is through school inspection, as you might imagine. And typically what happens is a school inspection team would go into a school, would talk to school leaders, teachers, governors, pupils, and observe the delivery of teaching and learning, and observe the receipt of that teaching and learning by pupils, and assess some of the work being done. Clearly, inspection was impossible during this period. We weren't going to send school inspectors into the homes of teachers. Many teachers were at home delivering online teaching and learning, and we certainly weren't going to send inspectors into the homes of pupils. The second point is that immediately upon the closure of schools, and I'll use that phrase as shorthand, we suspended school inspection. And we repurposed the whole inspection team. It's not a huge resource, but from recollection, it's about 60 to 70 staff to go out there and operate as link officers to support individual schools in any way that they could during this difficult period, and specifically using their knowledge and skills in pedagogy to assist schools in remote teaching and learning, to signpost them to sources of advice and materials on teaching and learning, to share good practice both within and across schools, and to gather case studies and to feed that back to the department. So to the extent that we had our school inspectors in schools supporting online teaching and learning, we had good feedback material coming to the department and the centre, which supported us in developing the guidance that was ultimately issued on remote teaching and learning. So it wasn't without a quality assurance process, but I would say this, I think it was a much more productive use of the time of our inspectors to go out and support schools at this really difficult time than to try and engage in inspection.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. I'd like to move on then to ask you about the further school closures in January 2021. Now, when schools closed in the week before Christmas 2020 as usual, I understand from your statement that it was the department's expectation at that point that they would reopen in 2021. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And is it right then that the department was not anticipating any further school closures at that stage?
The department at that point was anticipating schools opening again as normal in January 2021, and for obvious reasons, because we were all aware of the negative consequences of closing schools and pupils, we wanted schools to open. But as no doubt you're coming to, the Minister for Health and the Chief Medical Officer were starting to get very concerned about spikes that were arising in the incidence of COVID, and engaged with the Education Minister at that time. And they were making it clear that in their view, to stop the spread of COVID, schools really could not open as usual in January 2021, bringing 350,000 children and 20,000 teachers and so forth together into confined spaces would be really dangerous for public health. And I think that was a big difference between the second closure and the first closure.
And I think it's right, Mr. Baker, that the exchanges that you're referring to, they come slightly later in December, is that right? Towards the end of December?
They did, and it was coming up towards New Year's Eve and the New Year period, yes.
But just taking a step back, if we could, you've indicated that the department was anticipating that schools would reopen in January 2021. And in your statement, you said that no epidemiological advice was sought by officials at that time. Is that because you weren't anticipating further school closures at that point?
That's correct. But whilst we didn't seek any epidemiological advice, we received epidemiological advice from the Chief Medical Officer. And you will see from the note of a meeting which the Health Minister had with the Education Minister that the Chief Medical Officer was saying that the latest science was showing that children under the age of 17 were more likely to pass the virus on to others. And that, no doubt, was one of the reasons why the advice from the Department of Health was, please don't open schools as normal come January.
And just taking a step back again towards the start of December, given the rise in case numbers in late 2020, were any alternative scenarios to reopening, so for example, partial closures or staggered reopening, were those being actively planned for or modelled or discussed within the department?
They were. I think there is documentation from the Minister of Education who was setting out various options for opening, which wouldn't represent a full opening of all schools, but a sort of graduated opening of schools. And they were proposed, and I think that was the Minister of Education's first proposal to the Minister of Health.
And just a point of clarification, in your statement, and this is paragraph 473, you said that stakeholders considered it to be an open or closed scenario, as partial opening was not considered viable at that time. Can you help us to understand what led to that conclusion, that partial opening was not viable at that time?
By partial opening, we were considering whether you could have some pupils in 1 week and maybe another group of pupils in another week, and staggering it like that. and it was felt that that simply would be impractical and unworkable and logistically impossible. So it was either open or close with mitigations, and obviously with the exceptions for vulnerable children and special schools, which under any circumstances were to remain open.
And as you've already alluded to, Mr. Baker, at the end of December, matters moved apace, and the decision to keep schools closed after Christmas was again taken at Executive Committee level at a meeting on the 4th of January 2021. To what extent did the Department of Education have advance notice of that decision on that occasion?
I think we were well, first of all, I have to enter the caveat. I wasn't there at the time, and I'm speaking on the basis of conversations with my former colleagues and reading the documentation. But I think the department was well abreast of that decision, and I don't think there was any difficulty with that decision at all, because the Education Minister was fully involved and he was relaying those issues back to the department. So communications at that point were good.
And Mr. Baker, you've indicated that various options were under consideration within the department. Can you tell us a bit about the work that the department had been undertaking between schools reopening in August 2020 and December 2020 in preparation for the potential or the prospect of further school closures?
When schools reopened in September 2020, we'd obviously been through a period of closure, and our guidance on things like remote learning had been refined and updated. So when schools reopened in September 2020, we had laid down pretty clear expectations to schools as to what we expected from them, in the sense of any individual closures, or if individual pupils had to isolate or groups of pupils had to isolate individual classes or bubbles. We had pretty detailed guidance for what we called New School Day guidance in September 2020. So I think by that point we were in pretty good shape for offering schools guidance regarding the closure in January 2021, in particular in respect of our expectations on remote teaching and learning. The guidance was there, it had been updated, it had been refined in the light of experience and in the light of feedback from our link officers, and it was ready to go in advance of the closures of schools in January 2021. And indeed, I think the inquiry has received confirmation in the witness statements of a couple of school principals for Northern Ireland that such guidance was actually welcomed and in much better shape, obviously, than it had been during the first closure.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, before I move on to take your reflections, I just have one more topic I'd like to ask you about, and that is the enduring impacts of the pandemic on education in Northern Ireland. Now, I understand from your statement that the Department of Education has not commissioned any reviews nor conducted any assessments or monitoring in relation to the long-term impacts of the decisions made in relation to education during the pandemic. Is that right?
That's correct, as far as I know.
And if we could have up on screen, please, INQ 000 588 022 at page 101. Mr. Baker, I'd like to very quickly look at some of the contributions from participants in Northern Ireland to the inquiry's Every Story Matters record. And if we could look at the third quote, please. Thank you. This is a quote from a secondary teacher in Northern Ireland. We have schools now that maybe have 70% attendance. They just don't come to school because they've got into the habit of not going to school in COVID and they've never returned. And if we could look over the page at the second quote, please. Attendance is definitely down, punctuality as well. It's just like, I'll go in when I feel like going in. More and more parents were ringing up to get children out of school, and children texting their parents, ring up and get me out. We would have had an element of it before, but it's definitely on the increase. For some, the value of education has definitely diminished and people's priorities have changed. Mr. Baker, in your statement you characterise this issue as a significant concern, and you point to a 123% increase in persistent absence since the pandemic. So I think this is an issue that you would recognise as an enduring impact in Northern Ireland.
It is, and I think the data collected by the department backs that up. It is an issue which the Department and the Minister is acutely aware of. It is a major problem. And I think, in fairness, it is an issue, and again, I'm speaking from second-hand knowledge, it's an issue which the Department is committed to address. And I think, as we speak, the current Minister is considering a new strategy on promoting attendance amongst school pupils. I think that draft strategy is called Attendance Matters. Now, obviously, I can't preempt the Minister as to if and when such a strategy might be launched, but it is an issue of considerable concern because attendance has definitely got worse since COVID.
And in light of that considerable concern, can you help us to understand why the Department has not sought to commission any formal assessment in respect of pupil attendance since the pandemic?
Well, I think the Department has. I think, when the strategy... let's go back to the Department has not commissioned any work on the impact of COVID. It has looked at certain elements. There has been a lot of work done on pupil attainment. Northern Ireland has participated in international studies. There's been a lot of work done by the Education and Training Inspectorate on the impact of COVID. The Education and Training Inspectorate, produced a report on pupil attainment, well-being and teacher practice. But specifically, as part of the strategy for attendance, it has looked at attendance, it has looked at the impact of COVID, and all of that will be factored into the strategy if and when it is published, and measures will be taken to address that problem.
So, Mr. Baker, is it the case then that at paragraph 551 of your statement, wherein it's indicated that since the specified period, the Department has not commissioned any formal impact assessments on the impact of pupil attainment or attendance on children in preschool settings? Is that...
In preschool settings, specifically?
It's specific to preschool settings.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't answer your question. I was just querying whether you meant preschool settings. I am sorry. If I've said that in the witness statement, it must be true. I can't recall specifically.
No, forgive me. I think that was my mistake. It does refer to preschool settings.
Yeah, okay.
Now, Mr. Baker, you say in your statement, and just so that we can have clarity on this, you said that the Department did consider commissioning a specific Northern Ireland assessment of the impact of the pandemic on literacy and numeracy, but that due to practical barriers and the existence of a body of international evidence, that didn't proceed. I want to ask you, at other stages in your statement, you point to the availability of international evidence and independent research in explaining why the Department hasn't sought to commission certain pieces of work. To what extent do you consider that those provide a proper basis for gaining a thorough understanding of the impacts in Northern Ireland and a proper basis for future planning?
I think officials in the Department did consider very carefully the international evidence that was produced about what was happening to literacy and numeracy and so forth during COVID. And there was also a fair body of research produced by local higher education institutions about Northern Ireland. And they concluded that the position in Northern Ireland was unlikely to be much different. But that is not to say that there wasn't some work done that gave departmental officials an indication of the state of literacy and numeracy. Northern Ireland participated during the COVID period in some international studies. They go by fancy acronyms like PIRLS, PIRLS. I think that's Progress in Literacy and Reading Studies. That focuses on literacy amongst 10-year-olds. And then there was another study called PISA. I think that's Programme for International Student Assessment, and that looks at pupils in post-primary schools aged about 15, focusing on reading, on science and on maths. And we were able to use, I wasn't there at the time, but they were able to use those studies to compare how things were before and after the pandemic and whether things had declined. And indeed, subsequent to that, there have been key stage assessments done in schools, typically at ages 8, 11 and 14, on literacy and numeracy. And sadly, that found that 3 out of 10 pupils leaving primary schools were not at the expected level of literacy and numeracy. And I know that the department, through the Council for Curriculum and Examinations and Assessment, is commissioning system-wide assessments which will give good quality, hard information about educational attainment and what has happened during the COVID period. So hopefully corrective action can be taken.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Baker. And finally, Mr. Baker, you'll be glad to know we've come to your lessons learned and recommendations. Now, in your statement at paragraph 567, you've said this: there have been no formal lessons learned exercises commissioned, as the initial decision to close schools and a lot of the other decisions around societal impacts were driven by the Executive, Chief Medical Officer, Department of Health and Department of Education had to react to these rather than implement what it considered to be its own decisions. DE officials continue to work on policy areas throughout COVID-19, and whilst conscious of the impact, policy areas were not specifically reviewed to complement the specific, unique circumstances. Is it the department's suggestion there, Mr. Baker, that any lessons to be learned are perhaps for others, the Executive Committee, the Chief Medical Officer, the Department of Health, rather than the Department of Education?
No, I don't think so. And I would say to the inquiry that if I had to draft that statement again, I wouldn't present it in such stark terms. I think it would be more nuanced. During COVID and in our immediate response to COVID, we developed a COVID response plan which had a number of work streams in it, about 6 work streams. I won't go over them. And that metamorphosed quite quickly in May 2020 into an education restart programme, which again had a number of work streams. And whilst it is true to say that there was no single overarching lessons learned exercise on the totality of the COVID response. The individual work streams within both the COVID response plan and the education restart plan were subject to either independent evaluation, post-project evaluation, or inspection by the Education and Training Inspectorate. And I can give you examples. For example, you will recall the difficulties we had around the awarding of grades for public examinations in the summer 2020 series. That was subject to an independent review by an outside consultancy firm. I won't mention their name, but those lessons were learned and they carried through to the subsequent awarding arrangements for 2021 and 2022. The Engage programme, which we put in place to support pupils who had suffered loss of learning, was subject to an evaluation on lessons learned by the Education and Training Inspectorate. The food programme, which we put in place, was subject to independent evaluation. The devices procurement project was subject to a post-project evaluation, and so on and so on and so on. So the individual work streams were subject to detailed evaluations which exist, and I'm sure the lessons have been learned from them.
And Mr. Baker, in that answer you've pointed to reviews looking backwards. Looking forwards then, in your view, is there anything in practical terms that the Department of Education or practical learning that the department might take away from its experience of implementing these decisions?
I am sure there is no end of practical learning, and the department has learned from them. I'm quite sure, having spoken to my former colleagues, I know that the department is enhancing its capacity in the area of emergency planning and contingency planning, and has put in place dedicated resource for that. The department is working with all of its arm's length bodies to set up a strategic steering group on emergency planning so that it is better placed to respond to such emergencies. It is participating in, if I can use the term, wargaming exercises, and there's one going on as we speak, which you've probably heard about, which focuses on the potential for a pandemic, and there are lots of lessons learned. And from all of the plans that were put in place at the time and all of the individual work streams, there are lots of lessons learned for the future, which I think the department can benefit from if, heaven forbid, there is any repetition of this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baker. My lady, those are all of my questions. Have you any questions?
No, I have no questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Baker. Thank you for your help, and I appreciate not that easy when you retired and somebody suddenly passed the parcel to you and the music stopped. But thank you very much for coming to help us. Are you going back to Belfast?
This evening, my lady.
Well, have a safe journey. But
Thank you
for
very
coming over.
much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. 10 o'clock, please, tomorrow. Rise.